Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here. We are finishing up our respiratory system, looking at the transportation of carbon dioxide gas. Of course, we're talking about internal respiration here, which is basically exchange of gas at the tissue level. So this is talking, in the case of carbon dioxide gas, about exchanging the gas from the tissue to the blood and from the blood back to the alveolus. Remember, when we are talking about internal respiration, this is explained by Henry's and Dalton's laws regarding gases. And essentially, we can say that carbon dioxide gas will move from a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide gas to a low partial pressure of carbon dioxide gas. And the significance here is, again, we're moving in the opposite direction of oxygen. So let me do a drawing similar to what we did with oxygen. So let me draw 3 circles. So I'm going to have my first circle will be my alveolus. That's the singular version of the word. Let me do a second circle, which can represent my capillary. And let me do a third circle, which can represent, I'm just going to label it my body cells. Now, when we're looking at your body tissue, we'll see that it has, and I'm going to make some changes here if that matters to your notes. It has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide gas at about 45 millimeters of mercury. And so in the capillary, as it comes through, it's going to have a partial pressure of about 40 millimeters of mercury. And so obviously, if our CO2 moves from high to low, it's going to move from the body cell into the capillary. And so now I'm going to change my partial pressure of CO2 to be 45. So you have the CO2 moving in until you have equal level. That's the internal respiration. And then, of course, as that capillary gets, or it's not this capillary, but as the blood flows to the lungs, to the alveolus has a partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. So we're going to see that the CO2 is going to flow to the alveolus, and then of course we exhale that. So we're seeing movement of CO2 in the opposite direction of oxygen. So the question when we talk about the internal respiration and the CO2 is, okay, how is CO2 transported through the bloodstream? So really our conversation is all about, like, how are we actually transporting it? And we do see that CO2 is a little bit more soluble in the blood than oxygen. And so what we'll see is about 7 to 10% is going to just be dissolved in the blood plasma. About 7 to 10% of the CO2 is dissolved in the blood plasma. And so that means the remaining amount of CO2 actually enters into the red blood cell. Now, the rest of the carbon dioxide enters the red blood cell, and we're going to see like 20 to 23% is going to bind to hemoglobin. Now, we kind of use the analogy of like little hemoglobin boats to transport oxygen. And remember, we said like there are 4 seats. And we said that the seat was made from the hemoglobin and the heme group and the iron. And CO2 doesn't bind to the oxygen seat. It has its own sort of reversible seat where it attaches. And what we'll see with this conversation is we have what's described as Haldane's effect. Where when your partial pressure of oxygen is low, your CO2 binds more readily. So when we have a lower partial pressure of oxygen, then the CO2 is going to bind more readily. So if we think about that, what that's saying is as the blood is flowing through an area that has less oxygen, the oxygen is basically jumping off of the seat and the CO2 is basically attaching into that hemoglobin. The majority of your carbon dioxide gas, so we're left with about 70%, is going to be transported as what we call a bicarbonate buffer. And so let me highlight this. Majority of your carbon dioxide gas enters into the red blood cell and is being transported as a bicarbonate buffer. So now what I want to do is actually draw my red blood cell. So I'm going to draw a big red circle, and I want to make sure that I'm labeling it as my red blood cell. Okay. So that we'll see that this is happening in the red blood cell. So what we're seeing is the majority of the CO2 is entering into the red blood cell. Once we're in the red blood cell, we're going to combine with water in the presence of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. So we have our ASE ending, which helps us to recognize that this is an enzyme. And what happens is this is going to produce carbonic acid. So we talked about like where you have a lot of CO2, that's a result of metabolism, and then there's a relationship there in our low pH. Because carbon dioxide gas combines with water to make a carbonic acid, that's an acid. So that's going to lower your pH. Now, carbonic acid is a weak acid. It's a weak acid, which means it disassociates. And so I'm going to represent that by drawing arrows going in both directions. And when it disassociates reversibly, it's going to be making hydrogen ions. So there's the low pH part. And it's going to be making bicarbonate ion. So right here, H+, this is going to be reducing our pH. And then here we have bicarbonate ion. Now what we're going to see happening is that the bicarbonate ion will actually leave the red blood cell and go out into our body fluids. In exchange for chloride ion. I'm not sure that those look like chloride ions, so let me try to make that a little bit more clear. Somewhat successful. And so we call this, we get a bright color, the chloride shift. And let's highlight that. Chloride shift. So what we're going to see is we're doing an exchange, a shift or exchange of bicarbonate ion into the body fluid and chloride ion into the red blood cell. Now this bicarbonate ion is going to be an important buffer for body fluids. Buffers are molecules that can help moderate your pH. So what will happen is bicarbonate ion will pair with extra H+, which makes carbonic acid. And then you can just exhale your CO2 and you're left with water. No big deal. Or it can contribute hydrogen ion back. So buffers like temporarily store hydrogen ions. So it's going to be an important buffer, and we're going to talk about that when we do talk about regulating pH. When we get to the lung, we're going to exhale the CO2. And so that drives all of this reaction the other way. So you exchange back the bicarbonate ion and the chloride. You combine the bicarbonate ion with the hydrogen, you make carbonic acid. That was reversible. Carbonic acid then separates into CO2 and H2O. You breathe out the CO2 and you're just left with water. So the significance of transporting CO2 as bicarbonate ion is you're creating this important buffer that's going to help you moderate your pH. And also, this gives you a connection to the respiratory system. One of its jobs, so let's go back to the beginning because I'm not sure if we said it. One of its jobs is going to be to help regulate pH. So make sure you're adding that to your list of functions as well. All right, y'all. I think we've done it. Thank you so much for your time and attention. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.